The Grand Architect talks about saving the world. Dania might be the first time Wuthering Waves actually shows us what that ideology does to a person. That's part of what already makes her feel so different from a lot of other characters in the game. Because before Denia is even fully released, Wuthering Waves already gave her something that a lot of gacha characters struggle to naturally build: emotional presence. And with her official release right around the corner, there are some really interesting things to talk about here, especially now that the game finally seems ready to fully push her into the spotlight. One of the biggest complaints people constantly have about gacha storytelling, and honestly a pretty valid one, is how many characters are introduced at the exact same moment they become playable. Their introduction, their emotional moments, their story relevance, and their banner all happen almost simultaneously. And while that structure doesn't automatically mean the character itself is going to be bad, it does create a pretty common problem where a lot of characters never really get enough time to naturally exist within the story before the game starts asking the audience to emotionally care about them. Everything happens too fast. The story introduces them, explains them, gives them their emotional moments, and sells them to you almost all at once. But Denia is very different from that, because Wuthering Waves started building her presence long before her actual release. At first, we only got small hints about who she was, small pieces of mystery surrounding her existence, her connection to the Fractidas, and the strange emotional atmosphere constantly surrounding the character whenever the story mentioned her. Then slowly the story started revealing more. We learn about her connection to the Grand Architect, the fact that she was essentially used as an experiment, a test subject created for a larger purpose. And perhaps most importantly, the fact that once that experiment was considered successful, she was abandoned. That gradual progression is exactly why Dania already feels emotionally established before her story has even fully begun. Because the audience didn't meet Dania at the start of her story, we meet her somewhere in the middle of it, and that changes everything structurally. In my last video about the Grand Architect, one of my biggest criticism was that the mystery surrounding him eventually started feeling emotionally distant. The story kept preserving the intrigue, but it rarely felt like the emotional side of the character was progressing at the same pace. Denia feels almost like the opposite example. If Denia's entire narrative was viewed as its own standalone story, then the upcoming Segway quest feels less like the beginning of her character arc and more like the third act finally starting. The setup already happened. The mystery surrounding her existence was established, the emotional tone surrounding the character was established, the tragedy behind her situation was established. Even the larger thematic connection between her and the Grand Architect was already put into place long before her actual release. That's part of why people are already emotionally interested in her despite still knowing relatively little about her overall story. Because Wuthering Waves allowed anticipation to naturally build over time, instead of trying to force emotional attachment the moment the character became playable. The story gave Denia room to exist before fully pushing her into the spotlight, and honestly, I think she might genuinely be one of the best structurally introduced characters Wuthering Waves has had so far because of that. Of course, what makes Dania interesting isn't just the way she was structurally introduced into the story, it's also who she actually is as a character. At first glance, sure, you could look at her and say she's just another tragic character, and Wuthering Waves is definitely not lacking in tragic characters at this point, but I don't think tragedy itself is what makes Dania compelling, it's the kind of tragedy she represents. Because despite everything that happened to her, despite being treated like an experiment rather than a person, despite being shaped by the Grand Architect and the Fractidas, the story still constantly frames her as someone resisting that role emotionally. She's not a character consumed by cruelty or hatred, if anything, the opposite. Even with the power she was given, even after everything she went through, we still see hints that she doesn't actually want to hurt people. She doesn't want to become the kind of existence the Grand Architect seemingly intended her to be. That's what gives her story so much emotional potential moving forward. Because at its core, Denia's story doesn't just feel like a story about suffering, it feels like a story about someone trying to hold on to their humanity after being treated as something inhuman for most of their life. That's a very important distinction, especially in a story like Wuthering Waves where so many characters are constantly shaped by pain, sacrifice, and loss. Denia's story feels less focused on revenge or destruction, and more focused on whether someone who was created as a tool can still learn how to live as a person. Not to mention, I think the mystery surrounding her was also handled surprisingly well because of that. Because unlike some mysteries that drag on for so long that the audience eventually stops caring, Denia's story was slowly progressing emotionally alongside the mystery itself. The story kept leaving small pieces behind: her connection to the Grand Architect, her unstable existence, the emotional loneliness surrounding her, the hints that she was resisting something inside herself. There was always enough there for the audience to emotionally engage with the character even before we fully understood her. That's the difference between a mystery that only exists to hide information and a mystery that actually deepens emotional investment over time. The mystery surrounding Denia doesn't just make people curious about what she is, it makes people emotionally curious about who she is. That's a much stronger kind of mystery storytelling overall, especially because depending on how Wuthering Waves handles her Segway quest moving forward, Denia has the potential for a very strong emotional character journey. Not just because of the tragedy surrounding her past, but because the story already established the emotional foundation needed for the audience to genuinely care about where her future goes next. This is where Denia's story becomes important beyond just the character itself. Right now, Wuthering Waves has a pretty interesting opportunity in front of it with her, not just to tell a good emotional story, but potentially to strengthen the emotional structure of the entire game moving forward. Because one of the biggest problems a lot of long-running gacha stories constantly struggle with is what happens after a character's big emotional moment is over. A character gets introduced, they receive their emotional spotlight, they get their own dedicated story episode, the audience emotionally connects with them for a patch or two, and then eventually the story moves on, because structurally, their emotional importance starts shrinking once their release window ends. This is something Wuthering Waves itself has struggled with at times too. A lot of characters have very strong individual moments, but the emotional continuity between those characters sometimes feels fragmented afterward. The story introduces emotional arcs, resolves them, and then often moves on before those relationships fully evolve naturally over time. But Denia feels like a character who could potentially change that, because her story doesn't feel structurally isolated. If anything, it feels like her story is only now truly beginning. Unlike a lot of other characters whose emotional arc mainly exists inside their own dedicated episode, Denia is deeply connected to multiple layers of the narrative at the same time. She's connected to the larger overarching conflict through the Grand Architect and the Fractious. She connects to the emotional side of the story through her trauma, loneliness, and struggle to live as a normal person after being treated as an experiment, and perhaps most importantly, she also has the potential to emotionally connect with the larger cast outside of Rover themselves. I think that last part matters a lot more than people sometimes realize, because one of the easiest ways for a world to start feeling emotionally small is when almost every meaningful emotional relationship constantly revolves around the protagonist. The protagonist becomes the emotional center, the emotional resolution, and the emotional anchor for nearly every character arc. And while that structure can absolutely work, it also tends to make the rest of the cast feel emotionally disconnected from each other once their individual episodes are over. But Denia's story could naturally move in a very different direction, especially with characters like Sigrika, where, unlike many relationships in Wuthering Waves that mainly exist through Rover's perspective, Denia and Sigrika already share emotional history independent of the protagonist entirely. There's already emotional familiarity there, emotional trust, emotional attachment. Even if Denia was originally pushed into that role because of the Grand Architect's plans, the emotional bond itself still feels genuine. Denia and Sigrike have history that exists without Rover, and Denia's position is unique in another way. She's connected to both the main story and the side cast, which means she could bridge the exact gap where WuWa usually loses characters. That's why her potential is different from everyone else's. So I really hope Wuthering Waves fully commits to developing relationships like that moving forward, because it would help the larger world itself feel more emotionally interconnected, and I think Wuthering Waves needs more of that. The game already has a very strong foundation when it comes to atmosphere, themes, emotional tone, and larger scale narrative ideas, but one thing that could still evolve significantly is the emotional continuity between its characters over time. Not just characters emotionally connecting to Rover, but characters emotionally continuing to matter to each other even after their main spotlight ends. Denia is one of the best opportunities the story has had so far to really pushed in that direction. Depending on how her Segway quest is handled, her story could become much more than just another tragic character episode. It could become a story about recovery, about emotional reconnection, about learning how to live as a person after being treated like an object for most of your life. And if the story fully commits to that emotional journey instead of treating it as something isolated to her release patch, I honestly think Denia could become one of the most emotionally important characters Wuthering Waves has introduced so far. But at the same time, I also think that's where the biggest risk surrounding her story exists too. If the game eventually falls back into the same pattern a lot of gacha stories struggle with, where the emotional arc mostly ends once the character release window passes, then a lot of the emotional setup surrounding Dania right now could lose a huge amount of its long-term impact. I really hope that doesn't happen. After all, Wuthering Waves already did something genuinely very smart with Denia. They gave the audience time to emotionally care about her before fully pushing her into the spotlight. Now the real question is whether the story is finally ready to let a character like that continue mattering emotionally even after the spotlight moves on. Well, that's gonna be all for me for this one. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.